Hello, and welcome to our first episode of How to Polish Your Firearm. And what we're going to discuss is going to be basically getting your gun ready to do your bluing job that you want to do on your firearm, whatever it may be. We're going to talk about how you get parts just in the white, remove damage, and all that. So where do you start? Well, obviously you have to take the gun apart. We're not going to cover that. You'll have that done. And you'll probably be researching a lot of YouTube videos on how to take it apart if you're not familiar with it. So moving on to the next step is going to be degreasing. What are some of the ways to degrease a gun? There's a lot. The easiest ones are going to be just taking, oddly enough, like just scrub brushes, cleansers, degreasers. You can soak it in degreasers. But cleanser, soap, Dawn dish soap works really well. Hot water, bucket of hot water, and just start scrubbing it. You can get a lot of grease and old stuff off of there. You can even start with like steel wool and probably some mineral spirits or some acetone, lacquer thinners, stuff like that. Anything to just get rid of the grease. Now, it's important to get rid of the grease before you start polishing because you don't want to transfer all those. If you start polishing it, you're going to transfer all that grease and that oil into all of your Emery papers, your files, and you're just going to be making more of a mess than what you really want, and you don't want to do that. So getting it degreased, the best ways, scrubbing it, soaking it. Another way to do it, if you have any tanks at your disposal, metal tanks or something like that, you can boil them in hot water. That will actually does a really good job of getting rid of grease. One thing to be aware of, once you boil it in hot water, there's a very good chance it's going to start rusting on you. So that's another thing to contend with. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on how to keep it in a state where you don't have to worry about it re-rusting on you again. But anyway, once you get it degreased, then you're going to want to move on to the polishing part, the actual polishing part. And we're going to talk about what are the tools and equipment that you use to get it polished. Now, that's a good point to get into what is the difference between polishing and metal finishing and kind of repair work and restoration. And they're all a little bit different. Metal finishing is pretty much done at the very end of the polishing cycle to get the steel into the final state that you want it before finishing. But what we're going to do is we're going to be starting with repairing. And I'll see if I can hold this up here. You can see there's a lot of surface rust on here, and there's going to be pits, and the edges are not very straight and sharp. This is an old, I think it's the barrel off of an old 86 Winchester. So we're going to look at working on octagon barrels. Also, we're going to be working on round barrels and how you remove deep gouges, pits, how to maintain lettering, work around lettering and all that stuff so you don't ruin it. Sometimes if you really want to go all out and your lettering is not good or there's like a lot of damage in it, there's nothing that you can do. You just kind of got to polish it all off, either send it out and have it either the roll marks put back in it or send it to an engraver and have them fix it and get it back into the state that you need before you do the bluing. So anyway, let's talk about once you have it apart, once you have it degreased, what do you need to do? How do you start? Well, let's start with the tools that you have to use to do the job. And that is going to be files, are going to be your main friend on this. So when you're talking about files, there's obviously different styles, types, shapes, round files, half round files, and then there's courses and grades and basically the grit of a file. And there's charts out there that you can go and reference and kind of help you determine what you want. There's really only a couple that are going to be applicable for what you want to use it for. Most of that is going to be Bastards. Yes, that is a file name. It's a more of an aggressive cut. It's a type of let me see if I can get that up there. It's a type of a pretty aggressive file, and that's where you're going to want to start. And it's going to remove a lot of material. Now, conversely, on that, it's also going to leave a lot of deep file marks in your steel, which you're going to have to work out. And it's just like any other abrasive. You start with a more coarse grit, you have to work your way up to a finer grit, removing all the marks that the previous course of abrasive left in the steel. Starting with a bastard, what else do you have? Mill smooth files. Smooth files are pretty much just like the name implies. It's a much smoother surface. Let me see, show you that one there. Maybe get a close up on it, show you what that looks like. So it's a smoother file. You don't have to start with a bastard. You can just start with a mill smooth, and that'll be plenty good enough. You don't need all these different files. Just having a couple different tools at your disposal obviously will make your job easier. Shapes of files, sometimes to get into the rounds of things. Perhaps maybe if you need to get into something, you can use round files, a tight curve or a radius, or a half round file. Larger obviously is better to match your contours of your steel. I like the 12-inch files, and once we get into some demonstration, you'll see why, but a 12-inch file just gives you a nice amount of leverage on each side of the file to keep it flat and to keep it straight while providing enough working distance between it. A 10-inch file like this, by the time you get your hand around it and you start working it, you have a lot less area to work with, which may or may not be important for your task and for what you're doing. But quality files, important. If you don't have access to them, obviously you have to use what you have to. I don't know, maybe finding used ones on eBay might be a thing if they're not all damaged and beat up. Yeah, might be a source. Back to the papers, Emery papers. These things are going to be J close. So J is a weight of the cloth on it. It's pretty thick. You're not going to burn through them. You can use regular sandpapers, but that's just a paper product. Great for wood, but when you're working with metal, they don't last. You'll tear through them. You can use them if you have a whole bunch of it, want to use it up, or it's all you have access to, great, use it. You're just going to go through that a lot faster than if you have a good Emery. Now this happens to be a 2-inch wide Emery. I think that's perfect. It's excellent for wrapping it around your file. It gives you enough where you can fold it over the file, hold it with your fingers while you're working the steel. That's important. This stuff comes in different widths, and I highly, highly, highly recommend having the 2-inch. Like I said, you just take it and wrap it around there, and you can work it that way. If you get with a thinner one, you're not going to have that, or a narrower paper, you're not going to have that ability to wrap it around there. And then it's going to be sliding and slipping, and it's going to make your life more difficult. So 2-inch wide, Emery, J-weighted cloth. Brands, 3M and Norton, I almost use only. I went down the path of trying to save money on files and save money on abrasives. It never works out. It's cheaper initially, but in the long run, when you got a whole gun to polish, it's going to take you a long time. You have hours invested in doing this. You are definitely going to appreciate the benefits of having good abrasives. They're going to work better, cut faster. They're going to give you a more consistent cut. You'll actually go through less of them. I think you're going to save money on them. That's just me from someone who's been doing it for a really long time. Bad abrasives and bad equipment are just not a good idea. And just like I said, they end up costing you more money in the end anyway. So file maintenance, I'll show you actually, I'm going to go through polishing and how to do that. But when you're using the files, as you're abrading material and you're removing material, what's going to happen is that material is going to want to get caught up in the teeth. So once that happens, there's a couple of ways to clean out the teeth on it, and we're going to talk about that right now. You have a file card, which is just a lot of like little tiny wires on there, and they're all kind of bent, and they're just designed to be able to go in there and clean any embedded metallic debris from your filing that gets caught in there. Works really well, and it works for all grades of files, whether it's a mill smooth or your bastard. And the last thing you want to do while you're polishing a gun is have a dirty bastard on your hands. So clean your dirty bastard. Anyway, again, just get in there and you kind of want to follow the grain of the file, then the texture of the file, and that'll clean it out. Now, one thing that people have been using for a lot of time is soapstone. You just take soapstone and put it on there. And the idea behind it is the soapstone just embeds itself into the file and it prevents the debris, the shavings, the fine steel shavings from embedding in there. And why do you want to do that? When you're working on a piece of steel and you're polishing it, you're going to be removing material. That's a whole nother thing I'll get into. You're going to be removing material in a fashion, which means you're going to be pushing it and you're going to be pulling it. Now, when you do that, what can happen is that embedded shavings of that steel can get in here, and when you come back, it actually will drag and put a file mark back in it. It can happen going forward too, and you'll feel it. You'll be cutting, and then it'll get a little bit clogged up, and when you push it, you'll almost feel it like skip a little bit. It won't feel right. Believe me, you'll know it when it happens, and when you look at your steel, you're gonna see there's going to be a big mark in it that you now have to polish out. So the reason for the soapstone is to embed your file with the soapstone. And again, you just put it on there and rub it around, and it's going to just embed itself in the teeth of your file, and it's supposed to prevent it. Now, I say supposed to. Generally, once you probably get into this, I used to use it quite a bit years ago. I kind of found myself not using it a whole lot after I got a lot more proficient at prepping and metal work. And as I'm polishing, I just find myself banging my file on the vise. Now, I'm not trying to beat the heck out of it, just tapping it, and you'll see all the particulate and shavings just come out of the file, and that will keep it clean. So that's kind of a basic rundown of the files and the sandpapers and the tools we're going to use. It's not really rocket science. People think polishing a gun and all that on a professional level is, probably a lot more magical and secretive than it is. It's not. You end up just being filthy and dirty, and it's a lot of elbow grease and a lot of repetitive draw filing motion back and forth. That's pretty much it. So now that we talked about the equipment and what to use and some of the ways how to do it, and you get that metal in the white, it's going to be a little bit before that you blue. You're going to want to preserve it and prevent it from rusting. Again, and that's where just taking like a fine oil and putting it on that steel after it's all in the white and degreased will help hold it over until you go to actually do your bluing, whether it's rust bluing, hot bluing, doesn't matter. Any of the metal finishes, you just want to keep it in a clean state. So you should have a cleaning stage before your bluing process anyway. So putting a little bit of like a clean oil on there isn't gonna hurt a thing, and it doesn't need to be a heavy grease or a heavy oil or anything. It could be maybe even something as light as a mineral spirit. At one point we were using, for a special project with a manufacturer, we were using like an electromotive cleaner that for whatever reason, once they applied it on there, the steel didn't rust, and they could ship it and we could take care of it. And we didn't have to remove a bunch of oil in the process, which was good, because of the process that we're using, any oil, the heat would have spoiled the finish. So there's a lot of different ways, and you can get quite creative with that. And probably the time between you polish and the time you blue is probably not going to be that great. Hopefully you don't live in a humid, super humid climate. That's where it's going to be worse. How do you hold the material properly in place to keep it moving around on you when you're doing your polishing? If it is within your budget, I highly recommend getting a good machinist vise, like a Wilton or something like that. Now, when I say they're expensive, they are expensive. This vise here was just a little over $100, and the only reason I bought it was to clamp it to this bench to do these videos. It'll be good enough for doing these demonstrations, and I'm gonna do my best to not curse at it the whole time through, but believe me, when you get a good vise, again, I would go look at possibly buying a used one, but a good American-made machinist vise with big enough jaws and preferably smooth. A lot of times a good vise, you can reverse the jaws on it, flip them around. One side will be serrated, the opposite side will be smooth. My main vise I use, and I wasn't going to detach it from my main polishing bench for this, so that's why I just went out and I bought this thing here. Clamping your work. How do you clamp your work? So I've seen guys over the years, and myself, I've tried a lot of different things. Wooden blocks. It can make a wooden, you make a wooden block and you make the bottom, you cut it out so it goes over the center column of the vise, and you can put your stuff in there and just crank it down. 2 pieces of plywood. Works great. Nothing wrong with that. There's vise pads that you can buy. I'm just going to cut to the chase. All that stuff works. Use what works best for you. Again, and I'm just going to say this now, these are all suggestions and recommendations that on my style that I've come up with from the files that I use, the type of equipment you use, and the processes and the techniques that I've developed. They're mine. Use them for whatever you can get out of them, and then make it your own. So everything that I'm about to tell you, you can keep it and use it, throw it out the window, do whatever you got to do. But everybody works a little bit different. It's like turning a screwdriver. No 2 guys use a screwdriver the same way, and that's going to be the same thing with polishing. But your end goal is really what's going to matter, and that's what we want to try to achieve. So back to the vise. How do I hold a piece of steel in there? Believe it or not, just a goofy old rag that's maybe folded up. Now, a lot of times you'll have a barrel that's tapered. It's thinner at one end, thicker at another end. Well, how are you supposed to do that? Well, simple. Just take it and fold it, and you'll figure out quick how to use it. Stick it in there and get the thicker end towards the thinner edge of the barrel and just tighten it down. Now, you'll know when you got it because it'll stop moving. Now, I don't have the fold quite right on here, so I'm going to change that out a little bit. There we go. That's just about perfect. This is what I mean about a better vise. It has a lot less motion in the screw to get the same amount of clamping force. Now that's clamped down pretty good. That ain't going to move at all. So that, you can polish on that. It's not going to move. The last thing you want is for your work to be moving around. And we'll get some good, once we start polishing, you'll see, I'll have some overhead footage and you'll see exactly how we're using the files and all that. Lighting. Lighting is hugely, hugely, hugely important. I can't stress enough how important lighting is. Even with, all the tools and all that stuff. Lighting is the key that is going to allow you to actually see what you're doing. It's going to allow you to actually see what kind of job you're getting with your polishing. So as you're polishing this stuff away, and we're going to talk about some techniques on how to check your polishing, and cross polishing is one of that. Put a pin in that. We're going to get back to that one definitely. But you got to have quality lighting just to make sure things are straight. So again, bright lights, white lights, fluorescent, big fluorescent tubes overhead. You don't have to light up your whole thing, but especially right over your work area, getting down on it, you want to be able to have that light. And you also want to be able to hold your work up to it and look at it. You want to use a raking light over the workpiece, and moving it around, you're going to be able to see flats, you're going to be able to see imperfections, and you're going to be able to see any polishing imperfections, coarseness. Like I was talking about with filing, when you're draw filing, if you get a piece shaving embedded in your file and it puts a mark in your workpiece and you're filing it back out, that's where it's key to have a good light to be able to hold that up to the light using a raking light, again, to look at that workpiece and determine whether or not you got it all out. So where are you going to want to stop with polishing? That's going to bring in the next discussion. Where do you stop? Do you stop at 220, 320, 400, 600? It really depends on the finish that you're trying to achieve using the bluing process that you want. If you're looking for, let's start with just a simple rust blue. A simple rust blue on like a custom bolt action rifle or an older octagon barrel or round barrel lever gun. Doesn't really matter what it is. Just I'm using those as an example because there's a familiarity built in there, and you're going to use a rust blue. You really don't have to go a whole lot more than 320 grit. You certainly can, but it's not necessary. Most custom guns, bolt actions, lever guns, and stuff like that, if you're doing just a decent rust blue finish, 320 to 400 is great. Hot bluing, if you're doing, say, like a Model 12 receiver or a later gun, and it's going to have a little bit of a brighter finish, 500-600 grit is generally all that's really going to be needed. You don't need to go a whole lot higher than that. I guess the only other thing I want to cover in this opening chapter and all that is going to be following the polishing lines. How do you follow the factory polishing lines? Well, it's kind of important if you want to recreate exactly how the factory did it and to achieve a factory look. And again, that's another one of those things that when you look at something and it just doesn't quite look right, like if you've looked at a whole bunch of 94 Winchesters, we'll just take that for example, and you see this one and something just doesn't quite look right, it's probably because they don't have the polishing lines going in the right direction. And that's kind of sounds a little bit odd, but it's not. It's all those little things that add up to the end. So obviously, to find out whether you're polishing in the right direction or what way to polish the gun, look at what you have left. Sometimes if the surface is so bad, it's a little bit tough to know, but we'll just cover like a couple obvious things here. This is just a Remington receiver here. And so obvious, our polishing lines on the basic flat of the receiver are going to go longitudinally with the gun. Now, while you can polish longitudinally along the top, it wouldn't be appropriate, right? We are all pretty much used to seeing the polishing lines radially following the contour of the gun. So at this point, this is where we want to polish in this direction to go across it. Now, bringing up the fact that we talked about cross polishing, what I'm talking about now is the absolute finish, polish, and the lines on the very last thing. That doesn't mean you don't polish longitudinally if you have a lot of pits and rust or some damage you got to remove. Certainly do it. It's just your final polish and your final grain structure that you want to impart on the metal is going to follow the factory contours. Polishing lines. Follow the original factory polishing lines. If there's some there to follow that you can see, there's usually always, you can see it, like this whole receiver is pretty brown and fuzzy, but where the trigger guard was here in the back and the screw that went around it, there's still a lot of original finish around there. And you can see the polishing lines underneath those areas. So little clues, little keys like that will help. Rounded parts, keep the rounds round and follow the contours. And if you have any questions on this one or a little bit more clarification on the best ways to remove oils from guns, how to clean them, files, types of files, equipment used and all that stuff, go ahead, leave that in the suggestion comments, and we will we can make some other videos if we get enough questions on that, or maybe some other videos describing or going through what questions you guys might have. So anyway, there you go. Hopefully that helps, and we'll follow this up with some actual practical polishing of a firearm. All right.